Now I'm walking downhill away from the zoo. You're probably wondering why I would take the Max to the zoo and then immediately walk away from it. Well, we're not here for animals today. Well, I mean, unless you're considering animals of a lesser desired variety. So something happened, it seems, in Portland, kind of sparked in the mid-1970s. A spree of a variety of different levels, but a spree of sniper incidents started occurring, and it really started in 1975 and kind of carried on until the end of the decade. Multiple instances scattered all over this city. This is actually going to be it's going to take several days for me to hit all of the locations because they're so spread about. But it seems for the most part it really began right here, just downhill from the zoo, during the early morning hours of November 3rd, 1975. So Highway 26 is right through these bushes here. There's a roadway that crosses here, and we have Canyon Court, which starts going this way. So it's approximately 4:10 a.m. We got a guy named Claude Hendricks, 45, who lives in Cornelius, which is next to Forest Grove. It's several miles this direction, and he's coming this way, heading into town to go to a bakery that he worked at. And as we all know, when you work at a bakery, you got to be there nice and early. So it's just a little after 4 a.m. And I don't believe he was on this particular stretch of road. I think he was on just the opposite side, but right by Highway 26, which is right over the fence here. But I can't get there by foot. And there were mixed statements that said he was either on Canyon Road or Canyon Court. Now, Canyon Road starts just a little ways up there off of Highway 26, and this is Canyon Court. But they did say it was near the Vista Tunnels, which are that way on Highway 26, and near the zoo, which of course is right up the hill there. So, right in this vicinity. Now, as the story was reported in newspapers, which I don't fully believe, it just seems too nonsensical that he wouldn't recognize this. But as the story is told, Claude is driving along in this area. He hears a loud noise and feels a sudden pain in his leg. And despite this, again, as it's reported, he apparently makes it all the way to work before he notices that he's like bleeding out of his leg. And he hobbles into work, to his boss or whoever else is there, and says something to the effect of, "Some son of a bitch shot me." So the way it was reported was he just kept driving and just had a pain in his leg and didn't really look down or analyze it. Maybe he was merging onto the highway and didn't want to take his eyes off the road, but still, I find it so absurd to believe that this guy got shot in the leg and she's like, "Oh, my leg's hurting," and there was a weird noise, and then just kind of continued his trek and made it all the way to work. But yeah, somebody around here somewhere, maybe off in the brush over here, heck, for all we know, maybe in the brush here, maybe someone was standing in the dark along here. I mean, there's street lamps on the highway, but there's no street lamps here. I highly doubt there were any here back in 1975. So it seems somebody was in the darkness in this area during the early morning hours of November 3rd, firing off shots at somebody. And the thing is, Claude Hendricks was the only person injured that night, but there were at least 4 other people that were shot at during those same early morning hours. There were reports coming into law enforcement all the way up until almost 9 a.m. of shots being fired and people thinking shots were being fired in the direction of their car. So Claude Hendricks was just the start of that day's activities. And we don't have to go far to get to where the next shots were reported from. So it isn't more than 10 minutes after Claude Hendricks gets a bullet through his car door into his leg that at 4:18 a.m., so again, only roughly 8 minutes after Claude's injury, a guy by the name of Dale Bear says a bullet hit the left side of his car. And all I heard about where he was when it happened was that he was on Highway 26 right here. So I can assume, considering the closeness of time, it was obviously, I think more than obvious, that it was the same individual responsible for the shooting. And I would assume Dale was probably in this same vicinity, considering the fact that Claude was probably just somewhere up over here. So Dale was probably driving through here. So somebody was sniping. I don't know, maybe up on the bridge here. I'm not really certain. And there's a few locations I can't get right there. I'll have to use some imagery I can find because I literally can't get there on foot, or because in our next instance here, it's kind of muffled as to exactly where this individual was. But apparently at 4:25, only 15 minutes after Claude Hendricks is hit, and about 7 minutes after Dale Bear is hit, a guy by the name of Donald Mackey, it says he was just barely missed by a bullet that went through his driver's side door. So it seems like all three of these individuals were getting hit on their driver's side, which suggests probably the person that was sniping was maybe aiming to kill because they were targeting where the driver was as opposed to the other side. I'm not exactly 100% sure what direction all of these guys were going in. I know that Claude Hendricks was going east, so going this direction. But I would assume these other two guys were doing the same, which means the sniper probably would have been on that side of the highway. Logic stipulates if the driver's side of the vehicle is on this side of the car. But in the case of Donald Mackey, who's another guy that just barely got missed by a bullet, I read that he was next to Civic Stadium, which is now Providence Park. I also heard that he was near the Vista Tunnels, which are kind of just around the corner on the highway there, which... and another one said that he was near Canyon Road, which is, the merge is just up there. So these are all locations that are within close proximity to each other, but they're not the same spot. So I'm not 100% sure exactly where Donald Mackey was, but I'm assuming out of those three, he was probably in between Canyon Road and the Vista Tunnels, because again, he was only shot a couple minutes after Dale Bear was. So I'm guessing all three of these people were wounded in this general area. But again, reporting was kind of sparse in some instances. So there were two more people that were fired on before the 4 o'clock hour was up. And I'm walking just one block above or west of Barber Boulevard. So I'm a little ways away from where this shooting was going on, near Highway 26, Canyon Road, the zoo, all of that. So it seems far-fetched to think that two different people were sniping at vehicles on the same night, unless they were two guys working together, looking for the same thrill. But if that was not the case, and it was the same assailant, which logic stipulates it would have to be, this individual would have had to have had a vehicle, because the next individual to report being fired on reported this happening only 15 minutes after the previous one, which was Donald Mackey, who said he was shot on at about 4:25 a.m. And at 4:40 a.m., a guy by the name of Jory Jackson, who, this is one of a few locations in this video where I can't go to the exact spot because literally I physically can't get there, because he said he was driving down Barber Boulevard near the Hillsdale exit. And this is Barber Boulevard, right? Well, it's just white to you, but this is Barber Boulevard right here. And I'm here for a reason, but a little ways further down Barber, not too far, but a little ways, there's an off-ramp that takes you into the Hillsdale neighborhood of Portland. So it would have been a little ways down Barber over here is where Jory Jackson says his vehicle's fired at around 4:40 a.m., only 15 minutes after Mackey was shot at up around Highway 26, generally speaking. And now what Jory Jackson said is interesting, in potential distinction with these other shootings, which is that he said that a car was approaching him. I don't know what direction he was going, whether he was going north or south, but a car that was going the opposite direction of him. He said that he saw someone point a gun out their window, heard the rapport, saw the flash, and so it looked like somebody was trying to like do a drive-by shooting on him. So maybe that's an isolated incident. Maybe someone was just doing a drive-by that night. Maybe that's related to what was going on up around Highway 26 and the zoo. Maybe it had nothing to do with it. But if you go down these stairs, and I apologize, it's gonna get a little loud, but 15 minutes after Jory Jackson was fired upon, Paul Reynolds was also fired upon. So this big mess of commerce here, this is where the NATO Parkway and Barber Boulevard become one. However, back in 1975, this would have been Harbor Drive, the iconic Harbor Drive that was mostly removed to allow for the construction of Waterfront Park. And right here is where NATO and Barber come together, but back then it would have been where Barber and Harbor combined to become one. So at 4:55, right in this vicinity right here, Paul Reynolds says that a shot is fired in his direction and it struck his passenger car door. No mention of anybody shooting out of a car, so I don't know if it was, again, the Jory Jackson one may be different, unless whoever was shooting on this night was shooting from a car. I don't know, but this is where Paul Jackson was fired upon at. And as far as we know, that was the last vehicle that was hit. The last individual whose life was endangered by gunfire happened right back there. Was it 5 different people got fired upon during about a 45-minute span in time at 2 different parts of town. So it's unknown for certain if they're all connected, but at least some of them had to be. But the fact of the matter is, whether it was one person or 2, nobody knows who was responsible for those shootings. And that's going to be a pretty frequent theme in this video. And while everybody seemed to be of the collective opinion that these events were unrelated, there was enough intrigue that newspapers actually reported on it and made a point of saying, like, we don't think this is connected to that. But a story that kind of slipped through the cracks, especially with all these sniper events happening just hours later. At around 7 p.m. on November 2nd, 1975, so less than 12 hours before these shootings start happening, a 25-year-old woman named Sharon Coleman was driving south on Union Avenue, which is now Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard today, when she stopped at the intersection of Union and Lombard was a crossing street. She had a friend with her, and this vehicle pulled up next to him that had an unknown number of men in there, but there was multiple men in there, and they began talking to Sharon and her friend for some reason, and then seemingly out of nowhere, one of them pulled a gun and shot Sharon right there as she sat in her car at that stop. Her friend quickly hopped in the driver's seat and rushed her to the hospital as quickly as she could, but unfortunately Sharon died as a result of the gunshot wound she received. And it was just a bizarre, unprovoked attack. It seems some guys just pulled up and started talking, and then one decided to shoot. And Sharon didn't seem to have any, crooked background. Nobody that would want her dead. No violent ex-boyfriends, as far as I could see or gather, and even the police thought that as well. So it seemed like it was certainly not a sniping event, as one may think, someone being shot from a distance away, but there seemed to be, nobody knows why this happened, what provoked it, and it happened only hours before these sniping events, again, started happening. So unfortunately, Sharon Coleman's shooting kind of got lost, again, with what followed, and to this day, whoever was responsible for shooting her remains unknown. So it's November 12th, late afternoon, around 4 p.m. It's only 9 days since really this whole thing started. And, authorities are still trying to figure out who was sniping on the west of town near the zoo. And it was initially reported as being in the vicinity of Northeast 102nd and Hancock, which a portion, at least going east of there, still exists today. Hancock, between mostly 92nd and 102nd, was wiped out when they built, when they ran I-205 and the Banfield Freeway through there. That's where they meet. But it's likely that it actually happened a little ways away from there, closer to 102nd and Klickitat, which is actually right in the vicinity of where these freeways come together. So that particular intersection it doesn't exist anymore. And again, this was 1975, and 1977 was when a lot of that construction started happening. So at that time, 102nd and Klickitat was still a thing. And the motorists that heard the shots didn't see anything, just heard them and could tell they were really close, was around 102nd and Hancock. That's probably why they said it was in the vicinity of there, was because they heard them but didn't see them right in that immediate spot. But a motorist traveling near 102nd and Klickitat said they saw a flash and heard the gunfire, so they were like right there. And a police officer in that vicinity also reported hearing 2 gunshots coming from that area. Now, that alone might just be someone cracking off a few shots. That isn't necessarily someone shooting at a bunch of people, or if it is, it might just be a particular incident, somebody shooting at a certain someone that they want to cause harm to. And obviously I can't get there now because, the place where this happened is not only covered by freeways, but it's like you can't go there. You'd be trespassing. I don't even know how I would get down there anyway without hurting myself or getting hurt by somebody else. But that wasn't the only shooting that happened that day. Now, again, this is around 4 p.m. and it's where I-84 and I-205 meet. So you continue on I-84 going west towards downtown, and there was more gunfire. Now, I can't be sure they're related, but they're separated by about 80 minutes. An assailant, especially if they had a car, could have covered this distance easily, but around 5:20 p.m. So again, about 80 minutes after this gunfire is heard near 102nd and Klickitat, there's a guy by the name of, I won't call him Gary, Glenn Plants, who was driving on the Banfield in the vicinity to where 39th crossed over, which 39th is now Cesar Chavez Boulevard, when he saw something that he was certain was a bullet whiz by his car. And he heard a gunshot in conjunction with this. So he put 2 and 2 together, saw something. It had to have gone like right in front of his car. Like there's no other way you would actually catch sight of a bullet. They move too quick. Unless it passes right in front of you and you see that flash. Like, what was that? And then you hear at the same time. You're gonna put two and two together. And Plants said that he felt like it probably came from, I don't know, maybe he knew guns well, but from a small rifle. And that the shots came from, or shot, at least that he saw, came from the north side of the Banfield. And he said at street level, which I assume he meant at the level of the freeway. He may have meant at street level, like from 39th crossing over, but the fact that the bullet whizzed right past him would almost imply that it was on level ground with him specifically. And around this time, another person in that area said they saw a man dressed in dark clothing right in that vicinity, and he was carrying a rifle on him. So what are the odds that those two events are connected? And you know, these events happen so close to each other. What happened at 4 o'clock, what happened at 5, both events happen next to the Banfield. And you have a guy firing pot shots. It seems, you know, he's probably just got himself level with the freeway and just started firing at eye level, where you'd be almost level with people in their cars. Were they intending to actually execute someone, or were they just trying to scare people? I would lean towards just trying to scare someone, possibly. The fact that it seems like they only fired one shot that we know of. Now, of course, they could have started firing, felt they got noticed or had been noticed and fled the area and couldn't finish what they came there to do. But that's a pretty definitive sniping incident. And it may be connected to what happened at 102nd and Clickitat just a little more than an hour earlier. And despite being seen by somebody, I mean, obviously, I don't think anybody who wasn't looking for a death wish, or anybody that didn't think they were a lot tougher than they actually were, or did think they were tougher than they actually were, I think. Nobody was going to go and confront this guy. But obviously, police were called. It was known that there had been shooting earlier. But whoever this individual in the dark clothes was, sniping at people along the freeway, he obviously fled the scene shortly after and was never apprehended. Just another guy that we don't know who he was. Now, it's important to remember, because a lot of these sniping instances, the guilty party was never apprehended. So we don't know how many of these events were tied together. They may have all been isolated incidences. I get the feeling that with this many of them happening, at least some of them were probably the work of the same individual. But after this initial spree of gunfire in the early morning hours of November 3rd, authorities believed it was from a .22. And in fact, the following day, a 14-year-old kid who was walking around with a .22 rifle was apprehended by law enforcement when he was reportedly seen, like, you know, popping off a few shots. And he claimed he was just target practicing. I don't know what he was doing, but law enforcement took him in and let him go pretty quick. They were pretty certain he wasn't tied to the shooting. And the reason I bring the potential of it being a .22 into question is because on June 22nd, 1976, just a few months later, there's a group of people, 6 in total, and it's a little after midnight. It's the early morning hours, and they're hanging out at Irving Park in Northeast Portland, which, I mean, back in the 70s, there was a lot of crime in this area. A lot of shootings, handful of unsolved murders. So there was just a lot of crime and a lot of gun violence in this area in general. So this may have just been a random instance of that, but there was, again, a group, about 6 people hanging out at Irving Park, a little after midnight, just enjoying themselves. One of them was a 20-year-old naval, I don't know if he was in the Navy at the time, but he had been in the Navy, named Richard T. Williams. And they were hanging out They said near the vicinity of the swings on the Fremont Street side of the park, so to the north end of the park. And while Williams and his friends are in the park, they only noticed 3 other people. And it is the early morning hours. Not a lot of people are going to have reason to be hanging out in the park. It never said exactly what direction they were coming from, but somebody opened fire on them. Maybe from the darkness of Fremont Street. Which Fremont Street, it's a pretty busy street, but you know, not after midnight. And there's always been like thick trees that kind of line it, and it gets pretty dark there at night, even today. So back then in the 70s, it probably would have even been more dark. And so gunfire starts going off, and they start running for it. And Williams was struck in the back by a bullet from a .22. Hence the significance of that. Was there a connection between what happened in these November 3rd shootings and this shooting? Possibly. The other 5 people that were with Williams survived, escaped the scene, and felt, even as they were, you know, panicking and running away, they felt that whoever was shooting was definitely targeting them, just sniping them from the darkness. Again, probably somewhere in the darkness of Fremont Street, because that's where they were close to. And Williams was rushed to Emmanuel Hospital, which was just a few blocks away, but he succumbed to his injuries. And unless I'm forgetting something, I think that's the only, of all these cases I'm discussing, I think that's the only death. Well, let me rephrase that. The only death of an innocent victim or somebody being targeted. Not necessarily in terms of the individual firing the weapon. That's a different story. But yeah, Richard Williams, guy in the Navy, only 20 years old, paid with his life just for hanging out at a park after hours. And some theorized, I feel like it's kind of a weak theory, but maybe, you know, some people fly off the handle for just about anything. But it's thought that perhaps, you know, they're at the park, it's after midnight. I know that it says that he was declared dead at 1:55 a.m. and it wouldn't have taken long to get him to the hospital, and he probably died fairly quickly. So probably sometime between midnight and probably around 1 o'clock in the morning when this happened, if I had to venture a guess. And you know, people hang out at a park as a group. Sometimes you make a lot of noise, you get a little bit more rowdy than you intend to, and people come running out of their houses saying, "What the hell are you doing? Do you have any idea what time it is?" And just, you know, flying off the handle over a little extra noise. "My kids gotta sleep, they got school in the morning." And you know, maybe someone was just angered that they were making a bunch of noise and came out and fired off some shots. But I mean, God, unless you're like a real lunatic, someone who definitely shouldn't have a firearm, wouldn't you just fire off like a warning shot? Like, go home. All you would have to do is fire one shot, and the people in the vicinity of the park, no matter who they are, they're gonna flee. They're gonna leave the area. But they said at least 6 shots were fired, and they felt that they were being targeted at. As they were running away, they were being fired upon constantly. So the perpetrator was never found. The gun was never obtained, which, you know, makes sense if the killer wasn't apprehended. We don't know who did it, and we don't know the motive. If this individual was specifically targeting this group of people, again, if you dismiss the whole they were making too much noise and pissed somebody off motive, then why? You know, was it just a random act of violence by some lunatic, or was somebody in this group, maybe not even Richard Williams, but one of the people in his group, someone have beef with them, saw that they were there and opened fire? That's got to be a pretty big beef. But it is just another instance where we have a sniping incident, and in this case an actual killing, and we don't know who was responsible. So this is Fremont, which is this street, and then Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, which is the crossing street. It was Union Avenue back in the 70s, and there used to be a McDonald's at this intersection. I want to say it was at the northeast corner where there's a newer building. But man, this poor McDonald's. And again, I want to say it was at the northeast corner, which is where this building is now. Northeast corner of Fremont and what was Union. And yeah, in 1970, it was bombed in a bombing that was more or less blamed on the local Black Panthers, which there was no evidence for that. But that was the inference. But in September, somebody got into a building at this intersection. So I'm not sure what corner it would have been, but a corner that wouldn't have been where the McDonald's was. And they just started firing down on people. And I couldn't find a lot of information on it, which is wild. You'd think that would make quite the story that would pop up in newspapers here and there. But it really didn't get a lot of coverage. But yeah, employees in the McDonald's, they're just there working their job. And all of a sudden the bullets start flying. And so the McDonald's employees literally had to run and hide in the basement of their building, which I didn't even know McDonald's, maybe they don't anymore, they do, and it's just not, well, I didn't even know McDonald's had basements. But they had a basement at the one that was here, which was one of the older ones. I think it was finally demolished at the end of the 70s. It had certainly been through enough by then. But yeah, the employees were just there working, and all of a sudden bullets start flying. Few probably went through the window, and they don't know where it's coming from. So they have to quickly run and hide, and they found seclusion in the basement of their eatery. Now, I only saw this story. I found like no newspaper stories on it. I think I found like one, which didn't provide much more information, but the only information I found about this particular sniping incident was a brief reference in an article that I found on OregonLive.com. And again, they just mentioned it briefly. Somebody started firing shots off at that intersection near the McDonald's, and the McDonald's people had to run and hide. That's really all I found. I don't know if that particular sniper, because a lot of these snipers weren't apprehended. They just kind of popped off some shots and fled the area, and either it was night and nobody was around, or there weren't many people, or whatever the circumstances were. A lot of times these snipers were able to escape without being apprehended. And in this case, I don't know. I don't know if they established exactly where the shots were coming from, how long the shooting was, because if it was real quick, if it was just somebody trying to scare some people, jump onto a building, pop, 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 a few shots, and they're gone within a couple of minutes, even if the police are immediately called to the scene, by the time they get there, the person responsible is long gone, and they may be able to recover some bullets, which I don't even know if that happened, where they could maybe figure out the type of weapon, and if they ever got their hands on that weapon, they might be able to test it against the bullets and match it. But you got to know where that gun is or who the assailant is, and I don't know if any of that was ever established, or if that sniper, so to speak, was ever caught or ever did any time. So as I pass through the shadows that are being cast upon me by the Moda Center, I want to get just north of it, just past it. And this is the one particular story of all of these. This was considered like the big one. This was the one that got the most news coverage, the most attention, all of that. So this is, I think it's called like the Madrona Studio Apartments today. But back in 1976, this was a Holiday Inn. And on November 18th, 1976, a 20-year-old guy named Daniel Harmon Jones checked in to a room on the 5th floor. So it would have been one room on the top floor. And he stayed here for about a week and a half. He was set to check out on November 29th. 1976. But instead of checking out, he went up onto the roof of this building with 2 rifles, a 30-30 and a 22, and just started opening fire. I think altogether he took between 60 and 70 shots. He was firing into freeway traffic, which is right through here. He would have been firing on traffic over here. And when the calls started rolling in saying, hey, there's somebody in this vicinity shooting at cars and people, an officer was reporting to the scene about a block away from here, a guy by the name of Barry Cook. And when he was coming over here to respond, he actually got hit in the chest by one of Jones's rounds. Fortunately, he had a bulletproof vest on, so it just kind of bruised him up and hurt him a lot. But that would prove to be Jones's greatest undoings, was whether he intended to or not, he shot a police officer from the rooftop up here. So a bunch of police arrive on the scene. A SWAT team goes into the building, and they make their way up to the top. And it was a relatively easy apprehension. The guy threw his hands up, gave up rather quickly. A bunch of people, stormed the roof and charged at him, and he knew he was no match for them. And so Jones was quickly apprehended, but he got busted for shooting Officer Cook. But also, when an ambulance came to try to help, he shot at the ambulance and shot one of their tires out. So he got additional charges for endangerment. And after Jones's apprehension, when police went into his room to investigate, they discovered a letter to his mother that implied that he was planning on committing suicide, which partially explains why he might do this. Maybe he'd just given up on life and wasn't worried about the consequences. I'm not exactly sure what drove him. It seems like kind of a loss of purpose. The letter, he stated some point in the letter, and I'm paraphrasing, that, he was only 20, but he said essentially, I'm 20 years old and I don't see a future for myself, was essentially what the letter said. So it seemed like he was going to just go out firing. But when police and SWAT stormed the building, he gave himself up willingly. He could have taken his own life right then and there, but he didn't. He gave up and was sent away. And ultimately, I think he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for what he did here. I read in one article that he was paroled in 1984, which would imply he only did 8 years. I don't know if that's accurate, because he actually got in trouble for something else while he was in prison. So this story has nothing to do with sniping, but when I saw this story, this blew me away, and it makes me call into question more whether that statement that Jones was paroled after 8 years was accurate, because he was already on a 20-year sentence. And I think it was 1978. It was only 2 years after he'd gone away. And he's at the state prison, so he's there with all the bad people, the worst of the worst. And I don't know what the circumstances were, but apparently while they were in the dining hall, or whatever you'd call it, where all the convicts get together and eat, Daniel Harmon Jones stabbed Jerry Brudos and got busted on attempted murder, and was given an additional 12 years. So he should have been working off a 32-year sentence. And yet the implication is about 6 years after this, he was paroled. Maybe he was, I don't know. Maybe they didn't really blame him that much, because Jerry Brudos, who I've discussed before, is one of Oregon's most notorious serial killers, who killed at least 4 women during the late 1960s. He's known as the shoe fetish killer, among other names. And yeah, Daniel Harmon Jones hauled off, and seems like he tried to kill Jerry Brudos. So I don't even know if I'm mad at him. I don't condone murder in any way, but So yeah, just a little added story to the Daniel Harmon Jones saga. And what's of further interest in relation to the Daniel Harmon Jones shooting that happened here at the one-time Holiday Inn, and this is at Williams and Weidler, is the fact that only about 3 months earlier, someone on this overpass right here started sniping at vehicles down on the freeway. Now this is Weidler Street right here. And on August 24th, 1976, someone was just on this overpass. I don't know if he was on that side or this side. This side seems more practical with the more open view of traffic and how loud it is. But yeah, on that day, a gunman up here on this overpass during rush hour traffic started just opening fire on vehicles. I don't know if it was morning rush hour or evening rush hour, but it was one of the rush hours. And yeah, you know, people are getting sniped at, so people start calling the police, and the police report to this area, and they don't find anybody. I doubt whoever did it was just standing here on the sidewalk in full view of everyone. They were probably hiding in the bushes here, or hiding in the bushes over here, somewhere where they could be secluded. But yeah, the police reported to this area and never found anyone, and it's still a mystery exactly who was sniping at vehicles along the freeway here back in August of '76. And I don't think, you know, one inference that could be made was, well, Daniel Harmon Jones opened fire on the Holiday Inn here just a few months later. Wouldn't he possibly be the guy that was sniping from this overpass? Well, I doubt that very highly. So the primary reason I don't really think Jones is a good suspect for the sniping that happened on the Weidler Street overpass is because he was from California. He lived in California, I think, even at the time of the shooting at the Holiday Inn. He was a California resident. He lived in Independence, California. So I don't know what led him up to Portland. I don't know if anybody knows for certain. You know, maybe it was just, you know, he's feeling kind of destitute in his life at this point, and he just took off from the only place he knew his home and meandered and made his way up to Portland, where he finally, at least initially, thought he was just going to give up. And he ended up giving up, but not in the way that he intended. So, you know, I haven't found any proof that he was in Portland any other time than roughly November 18th to November 29th when he was staying at the Holiday Inn. I found nothing to suggest he was here during August. And the police did get a call from potentially the person responsible for the Weidler Street sniping. Someone called the police and openly admitted, I'm the guy. And he said that he was calling them from a payphone on Northeast 1st Avenue. I don't know what the crossing streets would have been, so somewhere along Northeast 1st Avenue, which I think would be like a block over from where I am right now, but again, we don't know where along First this individual would have been. But you know, when he admitted that, police quickly rushed to the scene where this payphone was, but nobody was there, and obviously the guy never called back. So it was a lead for about maybe 30 minutes, and then whoever was responsible, if it was this guy at the phone booth, he disappeared and faded off into mystery. But yeah, I don't think it was Daniel Harmon Jones that was responsible for that particular sniping incident. It just so happened that the two happened right next to each other. August 13th, 1977. Now, I tried real hard. This was the only story in the bunch where I found no information in terms of where this happened. The only information I got was that it happened at an apartment building in Southeast Portland, which Southeast Portland is vast. And there was one picture I found that, strangely enough, I found published in newspapers outside of Portland, but most Portland newspapers didn't post it, or even Oregon newspapers. And it was a picture seemingly as this event was going down, because you can see an officer crouched behind his vehicle with his gun drawn, and you can see the apartment in question. You can see like the front door, and you can see generally the look of the place in the background. And I could see that the address was 5005. And when I looked up, the way the addresses are in this city, that led me to believe that this apartment was either located along a road just on the east side of Southeast 50th, or it would have been a house along the south side of Southeast Raymond Street. I went up and down Google Maps, didn't find anything that even remotely matched the appearance of this building. But you got to remember, this was the late 70s, especially with all the demolition and construction that's gone on just in the last 10 years. It's very possible that the apartment in question here was demolished a long time ago. So it may not even be there at all. So I don't know exactly where it was, but I can tell you for certain it was along a road next to Southeast 50th, or it was on a road right next to Raymond Street. So I got close. So wherever this place was actually located, a guy by the name of Donald Deloney is driving around in his car and hears gunfire from really close by, quickly calls authorities. And the first officer to arrive on the scene is a guy named Stanley Harmon, who discovers that there's being shots fired out of a house by a guy named Dane Steppe. There's an E at the start of his name, but I'm thinking that's probably silent. It may have been Estep or Esteppe. And Steppe I'm just going to call him Steppe. It makes sense to me. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his last name. But he had recently moved into this particular place with a friend only a couple days earlier. He had just moved there. He was only 25 years old, but he'd already had a recent string of bad luck. 2 years earlier, he had been hit by a train. While you think, how do you get hit by a train? There's usually some reason. Well, in his instance, he got drunk and he was wandering along the tracks, and he ended up getting hit by a train. And that was Dane's biggest issue, according to friends and family, was that when he drank, he became an entirely different person, as happens to some. And they said he would just get belligerent and violent. He would threaten to kill others. He would threaten to kill himself. And when he was struck by a train, it caused him a lot of physical damage. It fractured his hip. And then a year later, he re-fractured that hip in a car accident, having to go through the whole process of, regaining his strength back. And it apparently caused him a lot of pain and left him very demoralized about life. And here's a guy who's only 25 years old, and he's just lost. And he's probably drinking more because he's like, I'm having some bad luck, so, why not? And for some reason, August 13th, 1977, he loads a .22 rifle. Here's another instance of a .22. And when Officer Harmon arrived on the scene, one of the shots that he fired struck Officer Harmon, actually penetrated his lung, and he had to be rushed to the hospital, where he survived. And it turned into a several-hour standoff, and it wasn't until the early evening hours, around 8:30 p.m., that police fired tear gas into Steppe's place and finally gained entry. The shooting had stopped. Who exactly he was targeting, who knows? He may have just been drinking too much, and he got violent when he drank, and he just stepped out there and just started firing. And so when authorities gained access to the place, they discovered a Steppe in there, and he was dead. He had shot himself through the mouth and taken his own life. I get the feeling maybe due to alcohol, maybe due to something else, but I get the feeling that under the circumstances and the duress that he was feeling, once he hit that police officer, assuming he knew that he hit a police officer, he may have felt that was it for him. You don't shoot a cop intentionally or accidental and just walk away from it. And he may have looked at his circumstances and said, there's no way out for me. And, in terms of him having this weapon and maybe possibly being involved, Estepi did also have a bit of a criminal record going back to 1969. And he'd been busted the previous month before this in July of 77 for public indecency. I don't know the circumstances surrounding that. And he also had a 1976 charge for weed possession. And in the aftermath of this standoff at his home, police said that he was a suspect in a rape case at the time. So unfortunately, whether or not he was a guy that liked to hang out and snipe at random people, it seems pretty clear he was, a bit of a pervert, it seems, if he was a suspect in a rape case and also busted for public indecency. A lot of his friends said he was a pretty chill guy, but that's easy to say when he's your friend. And, maybe the guy was at one time, and maybe the boozing and the injuries and just kind of getting despondent led this guy down a different path to now he's here taking shots from out of his apartment. We're now up in the West Hills, kind of just the east side from the peak, walking towards OHSU, where there were multiple shooting instances that I feel, due to one particular instance involved in the matter, was too quickly dismissed. And you'll see what I'm talking about as I discuss what happened here. During the morning hours of both October 8th and October 9th, 1978, there was gunfire heard in the vicinity of OHSU here. Could even come from generally where I am right now, which I'm finishing my approach towards the complex. It's a pretty good sized hospital, growing all the time. And during the first morning, I guess you could say, of the shooting, which was October 8th. Now, it's unknown who was responsible for the gunfire on the first day, but there were 3 men seen to dive into a green Pontiac. I'm not sure what color it was, what model it was, what year it was, but it was a green Pontiac is all they said. Obviously a pre-1978 model. And they sped away from the general vicinity of OHSU. That matter was looked into, but as far as I could gather, authorities never figured out who those men were or who was responsible for the gunshots heard around here on the 8th. And on the 9th, there was not only shooting, but a bullet was actually recovered from the wall of a building here that was specifically just to house patients. There was a bullet in the wall. Didn't hit anybody. Nobody was injured during these 2 mornings of shooting, which is nice considering it's, a hospital. But there was also, that same day, October 9th, a bomb threat was called in. Somebody called saying that they'd placed a bomb in one of the buildings here. Squad comes in. The whole hospital complex is mercilessly searched over, and they didn't find any kind of explosives, any kind of bomb, anything like that. So it was deemed that was a hoax. But you gotta believe, during that period of time, those couple of days, the patients here, the personnel, people had to be freaking out. Like, was this going to happen every single night? And as is commonplace, a couple days after these shooting incidences happen, on October 11th, someone contacts the authorities, anonymously of course, to say that they have information about it, and then never call back. Nobody has any idea who it was that called. But then things take another aggressive push forward when October 14th, just a couple days further on down the road, between 2:50 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., there were at least 6 shots reportedly fired in the direction of OHSU that were noticed by a security guard on site here. And he said that the shots were all coming from the north end of the campus. So just, you go to that side to the edge, and that's where the shooting was coming from, which made sense because especially back then when this campus wasn't quite as big, you were kind of going off into the brush a little bit, into the hills. So we now have 3 different nights of shooting, culminating in at least like 20 different shots being fired. And people are even more on edge. Here's where things started kind of falling apart in this situation. And again, I felt the whole thing was dismissed too quickly. And there may have even been a motive why that happened. So it comes out shortly after that these multiple shots that were fired on the 14th that were reported by this security officer, and apparently nobody else heard or saw them. It was discovered that he had made that all up, and probably in the aftermath of the shootings that had happened on previous days. And you know, unfortunately, some guys, they become security guards and they're kind of emasculated by that because they like want to be police officers and investigators, and they're stuck in their security position. And so when given the chance, sometimes some of them want to turn something, they want to make something big for themselves out of nothing. And I get the feeling that's probably what happened here. The security guard saw a chance to make himself look strong. There was gunfire and I was having to dodge it. Oh my God. But because that was reported as having not happened, and the officer in question, or the security officer in question, was arrested and busted on filing a fake police report. I don't know what that's for, but the sound it's emanating is frightening. So that pretty much, it seems, led to a halt in any further investigations on the matter. Because of that, and like, I understand that halting investigations into what happened on the 14th, but what about what happened on the 8th and the 9th? You can't say there was no gunfire because other people heard it. There was a bullet recovered from one of the buildings. Somebody was taking pot shots at the hospital here. That was happening. It may have not happened on the 14th, but here's the thing. According to the figures that I saw here, of course I have to check again to make sure I got them right. By that point, when this officer was busted and charged with filing a fake police report, the police had already dedicated 1,000 man hours and over $11,000 into investigating the matter. A lot of money to be spent on an investigation that's seemingly not going anywhere. So it seems to me, when all was said and done, it was easy to just drop the issue, save the money, and I guess hope there was no more sniping incidences that happened at OHSU there. And as far as I can tell, there weren't any. But when they decided to pull the plug on this, they didn't know that at the time. So it seems like they just decided to hell with it. Let's save some money. You know, so far, these sniping incidences, all these ones that have happened, you know, most of them we haven't apprehended anyone for. So that's probably going to happen here as well. So whoever it was that was sniping at OHSU on October 8th and 9th, probably the same individuals that called in the bomb threat. Seems like they were just doing their best to just scare the living hell out of everybody. Whoever that was, It's another instance where we do not know who they are or were. And before completely moving on from this series of shootings related to OHSU, on October 15th, 1978, the day after this false shooting event that happened overnight, there were reportedly 11 shots fired in the vicinity of Civic Stadium, which again is now Providence Park. Despite the timing, authorities felt there was no connection between that and what happened at OHSU. It just happened to happen at the same time. And there were no shells found at the scene. Authorities were generally led to believe that this was maybe a drive-by of some kind, someone shooting out of a car, which might explain. It was referenced specifically that no shells were found, which leads me to believe probably some bullets were recovered, and those bullets were deemed to have come from a gun that would eject shells in a certain way, and there was no shells found at the scene. And it's not really certain exactly what happened. It was reported that a little while before this shooting occurred, 3 or 4 men were seen arguing in the vicinity of Civic Stadium, and the shooting happened a little after that, so it was unknown if the shooting was something that came out of this fight that was happening there earlier, if those were just 2 different events that happened at around the same time. But again, probably not really a sniper incident of any kind, but it happened in the immediate aftermath of what had already been going on at OHSU, so people were already on their toes, and here we have another string of shots going off in the dead of night, something that unfortunately nowadays, especially in certain parts of Portland, that's just another night in this city. And the last story in this string of sniper-related events happening in the late 1970s happened on September 4th, 1979, from today it looks like it's either just a big long house, or it's probably an apartment house located at Southeast 30th and Taylor. And back in 1979, a guy named Dennis Delvin was either staying at this house or living there. And he was a 35-year-old man. There's not really much information provided about him. It's known that in the aftermath of this event, he was taken to OHSU, oddly enough, for observation. So I don't know if they felt he was having some kind of psychological break at that time, or if he had a past history of any kind of psychological issues. But around 10 p.m. on September 4th, he went up to the 2nd floor, popped a window open, and just started opening fire. And I don't know who he was targeting at, if he was targeting at anyone. It's a residential intersection right there, but he just started firing off shots from this 2nd floor window. And authorities were quick to the scene. They were quick to they evacuated everyone living within 3 blocks. And it's probably a good thing they did do that when they discovered the arsenal that Delvin had on him. Ultimately, a negotiator showed up, was able to go up to Delvin, and managed to finally convince him to give up. Around 11:15, 11:30 at night, finally Dennis put his gun down, walked out of the house, crouched to his knees, and surrendered to law enforcement without further incident. And fortunately, this is another incident where, despite there being bullets involved, nobody was hurt. No neighbors, no passersby were hurt, no police officers were hurt. And Delvin was taken into custody and sent off to OHSU for evaluation. And it's unknown, as far as I can tell, why he started doing this. Again, I don't know if he had a past history of mental illness or anything like that. He just decided to pop a window open and just start shooting out of his window, which, if you live out in the middle of nowhere by yourself in the desert or something, you're just shooting off guns for fun, whatever. But this is a densely packed residential area. It is now, it was back then. But when the police searched the home after Delvin gave himself up, they found 9 guns in there, one of which was a high-powered rifle. I don't know if they found a .22 in there, but they did find a lot of guns there. So this is an incident that could have potentially gotten much worse than it ended up being. Unfortunately, everyone came out of this with their lives, and as far as I can tell, with this being end of summer 1979, 1980's just around the corner, that was the last of these events to occur, but it was a succession of several various different types of sniping, shooting incidences that happened over the course of, this was actually less than 4 years. So after all of that, the lingering question is why? Why did this all of a sudden happen at this particular point in time? Because once it started, it kept on happening. This is not the kind of thing that happens frequently. So when it does happen, even if it's once every 8, 9, 10 months to a year, it's still a problem. It's still something that makes you think, makes you wonder, makes you worry, depending on who you are and where you are. And certainly a lot of people want to look at a lot of things like this and tie it down to one reason. There's one thing that's inspiring all these people, but you got billions of people out there in the world, and they all think differently. Certainly, some reasons are stronger in terms of understanding why people do things like this than others, but there were definitely a multitude of different things going on. And I think, especially when, again, a lot of these, one of the unfortunate things is a lot of these snipers were never identified, but the ones that were, for the most part, were young men in their 20s, just getting started with life. And yet in multiple instances, you had people that were already lost. Daniel Harmon Jones said at 20, he had lost his purpose in life, didn't know what to do with himself. He was only 20. And it seems kind of the same thing happened in the Steppe case. In 1977, you had a guy that had a drinking problem, was, he'd had a succession of different issues come along, and it seemed like, his life was kind of spiraling down the drain, and next thing you know, he's out there sniping at people. So I definitely think, and that is very encapsulating, or it's very representative, it's a better way to put it, of the attitude of the young people in this country, really at the end of the 60s and through the 70s. A lot of frustration, a lot of just disheartedness and stress about the future. The 60s ended in America so especially 1968. That's kind of one of the most polarizing years in American history. And you get into the 70s, and all these prime figures that make you think about the future in a positive light. Your JFKs, your RFKs, your Martin Luther King Jr.'s are all gone. And now we've just got Richard Nixon in the White House, or Gerald Ford, pick whichever deadbeat you want. And they're in control. And there was, during the 70s, there was mass inflation. There was continued mass growth that had really kind of come out of the post-World War II America. And the reason I even bring up something like population growth is because people that have analyzed serial killers, or why serial killers kill, they look at just how the big cities were getting bigger, and even the small towns were growing, and the more people you have around you, the fewer you know. And so there's kind of this breakdown of a community. You don't hear so much anymore, even in the last several decades, unless you live in a town that's so small. The story of how, I live in this town where everybody knows you. And if you're new to town, everybody knows because they all don't recognize you and all of that. And that's been kind of attributed to serial killers. I don't know how strong it is, but that is kind of another element. And just there was so much unrest. And then you have the There was major inflation in the 70s. People couldn't get their gas. And, anybody who's already struggling when inflation happens and it gets even worse, you see a lot more desperation in people, and a lot more, the more kind of strung out society becomes, the more people that are kind of on the fringe and already kind of ready to lose it, some of them go over the edge. And yeah, there was definitely a lot of unrest in the 70s, and a lot of people who felt a loss of purpose, who were seeing their friends struggle, their families struggle. And yeah, I think that's why during that period in history, during the 1970s, you saw everything spiked. It's most known for the onset of like this major explosion of serial killers. Like every other week there was a new serial killer. But it wasn't just that. That's what everybody remembers. But mass killings were up. Every single form of violent crime exploded during the 1970s. It seems like there was just this visceral anger all around. And you started seeing violence come out in all of its facets and at much higher levels. And it's interesting because especially people that weren't alive at the time, didn't grow up there, a lot of people romanticize the 1970s to a degree. I admit I do too sometimes, but I think in part because of the inconsistency. There were so many things that were really cool about the 70s, especially its art forms, its music, its movies. And then there was all these other things going on, and New York City was going into default, and just this collision course of things. And Portland's a major American city. These things were going to hit Portland just like any other major city. And it's like the ball got rolling in the early 70s, and by the late 70s, it was just out of control. And you just had one mass tragedy after another. The Jonestown massacre happened in 1978 on my birthday, 7 years to the day before I was born. And so, I get the feeling there's definitely part of that collective rage that was going on all around America. I see some of that in these sniping events. And again, with the fact that, so many of these snipers lingered unknown and we don't know their motives, there could have been possibly a lot of different things at play again. And we talk about Daniel Harmon Jones and the Steppe murder in 77. You kind of see the exasperation of just kind of a lost cause in life. And it's not that other people outside, on the outside are telling you that you're a lost cause. You've started to believe that yourself. Thank you for almost hitting me, car. But beyond that, how many of these individuals were actually hoping to kill someone? We don't know. Some of these people could have been just trying to freak the public out. That does happen as well. You never have an intention. It's not so much about trying to actually kill someone, but it's about feeling that power, knowing that you've put so many people in a state of fear just through one action where you didn't even necessarily kill anybody. Whoever was responsible for the shootings up around OHSU in 78, that could have just been to, big, massive, growing hospital complex, and wait, I can just shoot a few shots in that area and scare the hell out of them and keep them paralyzed. And as kind of a small person, that makes me feel really strong and really powerful. And I get the feeling that's what a lot of these were. Maybe some were a cry out for help. If I go outside and start just shooting, maybe someone will pay attention to me and my strife and see I've come to this point where I'm just shooting at people, because nobody's paid attention to me and I got to do this to get somebody's attention. How many people have killed a bunch of people, or at least tried to kill a bunch of people, just so that someone would look at them, just so that they'd have a name, just so they'd have a face in the world, at least as far as, where their mental mindset was at. So I think there's a lot of possible motivations, and I think in most instances, it was not actually to kill people. I think it was a combination of some people calling out for help, some people looking to feel a sense of power, and some people feeling lost in life. Or it could have been even a combination of two or all three of those. And so you see these people lash out in such a way, and I think that's why, you know, in all these instances I discussed, only one time was there an actual like victim who died as a result of the shooting. I mean, if these were just a succession of people that were strictly out for blood, you would have had a higher body count than just one guy. And for all we know, that instance, the Richard Williams shooting at Irving Park, for all we know, that could have been somebody who only had the objective of trying to scare someone. And you shoot a shot, doesn't quite go where you want it to go, or bounces off the ground and hits him in the back. You know, and in that shooting, it's another one where we don't know who was responsible. We don't even know what the motivation was, whether it was murder or just to scare someone. So there's still mysteries out there about this whole thing, but there's a lot of possibilities. And these were all individuals. And with each one of them, you have a different set of possible motivations. So no one theory fits to cover the whole thing. And when I stumbled onto this, I didn't know about any of this. And aside from the Daniel Harmon Jones sniping incident up at the Holiday Inn, the rest of these incidences are generally forgotten, really. I don't think a lot of Portlanders, maybe even Portlanders that were living in the city during that time, realized how crazy it got during these couple of years. But, you know, the one story that got everybody's attention was Daniel Harmon Jones. And even in the piece that introduced me to all of this, which was a piece on Oregon Live, where they talked about all these snipers in Portland during the 70s, 3/4 of the article was focused on the Daniel Harmon Jones incident, and the rest of them only got, you know, some may have gotten 2 paragraphs, but usually they each got like a little paragraph like this. And I'm grateful for that, because some of these stories I couldn't even find newspaper articles on. So that little blip they would post, that was like the only resource I'd have. So I'm grateful for that, but you can still see that a multitude of different instances can happen, and they're all unique, and they're all intriguing, and they're all distinct, and every story in the bunch is compelling, at least to me. So I always get kind of bummed when only one story hogs all the details and the other ones are kind of generally forgotten. I want to know more about the sniping incident that led all the McDonald's employees into the basement. I want to know a little bit more about the OHSU shooting events, the sniper on the Weidler Street overpass. And there's just not that much out there, because some stories they just get more attention than the others. And certainly the Jones shooting was the largest of the bunch. It had by far the most shots fired, but they're all compelling. And hence, that particular story is only one little piece of this video. So I'd like to thank you all for stopping by and taking in today's video. If you're new to the channel, haven't gotten around to it yet, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you like what you're seeing. That stuff all helps my channel grow. And I also have a Patreon that I'm hoping to grow a little bit, day by day, week by week. The link to that is in the description with this video, along with the links to my Facebook, Instagram, my Reddit subreddit, and my TikTok as well. So all of that said, thank you so much for stopping by. This has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.